I know part of your treatment plan that you talk about are targeted binders. Can you go into that and what that means?
Sure. And I just noticed I didn't answer the other part of your question was like people coming into the clinic, how many people. And when I first had the mold illness, I very deliberately was getting myself well. And I thought, I'm not going to go back to the clinic and assume that everything's mold, right? Because you know how we have those lenses where we see that everything's this, everything's this. And I was very deliberate, like I am going to look for it, but I'm not going to assume that everybody has mold illness. And more often than not, I'd go deep, I'd do the testing, and we can talk about testing and stuff too. And I would be like, oh my gosh, this is mold again. This can't be like how often. So when you say how many people, I would say chronic complex illness like autoimmunity, neurodegenerative diseases, or just things where people are mysteriously fatigued, brain fog, not functioning their best. I would say about 50% or greater. And I'm being conservative with that. Our root issues are mold.
Huge number. Yeah. And again, that's why it's so scary. But to get back to that now, good part of it all, the treatment.
Yes, so the binders.
The targeted binders. Yeah. Tell us about that.
Okay. So, and a lot of studies have come out now. I don't have this memorized, but I'll give you some tidbits. But there are some studies now on very specific substances for specific mycotoxins. So what happens, I'll give you just a tiny primer on mold. We have the spores, which are fairly large. They're typically like taken in air samples and things. And those typically aren't as antigenic or immune reactive as the toxins that mold produces. So we have the mold itself, which could be Aspergillus or Chaetomium or Stachybotrys or Willaria or any of these. And those are certainly bad and problematic. And if you have them in air samples, it's an issue. Typically something like a black mold, like Chaetomium or Stachy, if you are finding that in your air, it's a massive issue because it typically hides wet, damp things under floorboards and it's not in the air. So the other kind of testing you can do is testing the dust for DNA of mold. That's called an ERMI. And the ERMI data isn't the best. So we now call that qPCR. It's just another name for the type of testing it's done. And any person can do this without a doctor or even an inspector. You can get a dust sample yourself and test your house. And you can look at the species that are in the dust in your mold. So still we're talking about spores and mold. And then the next level is particulate, like after remediation. I always say it's almost like if you had a dried flower and you flicked it or blew on it and the particulate. So this dead mold particulate goes into 1 million fragments. And those fragments are super immunotoxic. So even if it's dead and you've remediated, but you have fragments of dead old particulate from mold, that can still cause immune damage and inflammation. And then the last thing is the mycotoxins that the mold actually produces. Now, this could be the mold is hiding behind the wall. Your air samples are perfect, but it's still producing toxins. And that's that level of the VOCs. It's like 0.3 microns. And these are things like trichocythanes, ochratoxin, aflatoxin, gliotoxin. And you can measure these as well. You can measure them in the urine of humans, and you can also measure them in a dust sample. So those are kind of the levels. And then with binders, we know that certain types of toxins are better bound by certain things. For example, ochratoxin, which is typically from Aspergillus penicillin, the prescription binder cholestyramine tends to be really effective for that one. And same with clay or Saccharomyces boulardii or glycomannans. And then things like trichocythanes, which are the really toxic immunosuppressive ones from the black molds. Those I think are better bound by charcoal, and clay works too. So I often, because there's usually more than one in each environment and each person, I'll use combinations. So clay and charcoal are two of my favorites. Zeolite is excellent and also binds to metals. Glycomannans, chlorella, and even just fiber like citrus pectin can be good for both organophosphates and molds.
Yeah. And it's so great that you're getting to this level of personalization, not just saying, hey, let's just throw something and see how it goes, because that is a kind of old antiquated way of going about it. Protocols for just general mold versus really being specific.